Okay, I guess we can start. Distinguished panelists, dear journalists and media representatives, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first on behalf of the Regional Cooperation Council and my team, the Roma Integration 2020 Action Team, to warmly welcome you to today's webinar titled Responsible Reporting on Roma Integration. I would first like to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to our partners, the Media Diversity Institute, and in particular, Ms. Milica Pešić for joining us today and for providing us with the many ideas and with conceptualizing this event into making it a reality. This has really meant a lot to us. Ms. Milica Pešić is also going to be moderating to this event after my opening remarks. But once again, thank you very much for the great support in organizing this webinar. I would not like to take much of your time with my opening remarks, but I will simply try to explain why the timing of today's event could not be much better and link it with some other ongoing processes and activities which deserve attention. As all of you know, on 27th of January each year, we mark the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day when we honor the millions of victims of the Holocaust and we protect the lessons and the legacies of this horrible history. Roma were among the many victims of the Holocaust, and more than 500,000 lost their lives because of the prejudices and hatred towards this particular ethnic group. It took many years to officially recognize these atrocities, and I unfortunately believe that it will take even more years ahead of us to officially recognize that these acts were done purely due to anti-Gypsyism, a specific form of racism towards Roma and towards everything that is perceived and represents the image of a Roma or Gypsy. The reason why I believe it will take years ahead of us to recognize anti-Gypsyism is because only recently, a couple of months ago, did the European Union adopt a new strategy for inclusion of Roma, where the fight against anti-Gypsyism is explicitly mentioned. It will take, of course, some time before the EU member states and the EU enlargement region will operationalize the requirements of these strategies into concrete follow-up actions and measures. Until then, I believe that we are currently at a crossroad where we need to start talking about anti-Gypsyism. We need to start understanding its manifestations, and most importantly, we need to start questioning our own role in preventing and fighting this phenomenon. I'm not going to underline here how much and why are Roma discriminated and marginalized. I believe that we all know the reasons behind it. However, I would like to underline that on paper, it seems that we do have quite a strong political support in furthering the process of Roma integration. Namely, a year ago, a very important momentum happened for the Roma in this region. At a summit organized in the framework of the Berlin process, the leaders of the EU enlargement region, the prime ministers, signed a declaration on Roma integration. And I believe that this declaration shows a clear commitment that there is a political will to significantly improve the lives of Roma. And this declaration actually has certain targets that the leaders have pledged to achieve in the upcoming years. And we strongly believe that all in all, this is a very good sign. However, the progress and the reality are a bit disappointing. Unfortunately, there is still very strong hatred present towards Roma. Prejudices are piling up, and the support of the majority population towards Roma inclusion policies seems rather on the downside. We are witnessing hate speech and hate crimes towards Roma throughout Europe. And with the increased access to information and increased access to social media, it is more than obvious that many people seem to freely express without any reservation their hatred towards Roma. This is why we believe that we all have certain responsibilities to generate knowledge and understanding of the Roma realities. We need to explain why certain policies and programs that are available for marginalized communities sometimes simply do not work for Roma. We need to also explain why integration as a whole requires a holistic approach. We cannot simply talk about education or employment or housing. We have to take the whole picture into consideration and discuss the consequences of institutional discrimination, which is very much present in the region. And most importantly, we need to understand that the economic empowerment of our region, or the economic empowerment where our region is aiming to achieve, must go hand in hand with the social inclusion of the most vulnerable. This is why we see the role of media as of paramount importance. Media has the power to construct certain images about race, about gender, about ethnicity, and has also the power to provide the overall conception of what does something mean. In other words, media has the means to provide an understanding of the reality in which Roma live. And this is why I believe that today's webinar will not only provide a space for discussion about what can we do to produce the right knowledge and dismantle the prejudice discourse, but will also generate opportunities for closer cooperation and most importantly for concrete follow-up actions that we could all jointly work together. This is why I would like to thank once again the journalists who took their time to join us in today's webinar. I see on the list that we have quite a big representation, and we are very much grateful for this. We at the RCC are also grateful with the strong cooperation that we have established with many of you so far, and we are very much looking forward to deepen this cooperation on the topic of Roma inclusion. I would like to all thank you for your attention for my opening remarks. And before I pass the floor to Ms. Pesic, who will moderate this event, I would like to invite you all to watch a short video that has been prepared by an independent journalist who is heavily involved for years already on the topic of reporting on Roma inclusion, Mr. Asim Beshlia. So I would kindly ask the organizers, the technical support to play the video. And after that, Ms. Pesic, please, the floor is yours.
I've been covering the Roma questions in the last 5 years for different media outlets and in different forums. And what I can say from my experience is that it all comes down to one thing only, the question of human rights. This is the only angle of the story that we should look at when making our reports about Roma communities. Because decades of inequality, anti-Gypsyism, and practical discrimination have brought this part of our population to extreme poverty, with no jobs, no documents, no education, no health security. That equals social invisibility. Try to put yourself in their position. This is the best approach. Try to ask why someone would choose to live on gathering garbage or iron, to suffer or be excluded. Roma are unequal, judged, discriminated for no big reason other than prejudice or anti-Gypsyism. So what we as a media need is a greater understanding of what anti-Gypsyism is and changed views. When we make our reports, we have to go beyond prejudice and always respect the journalist code of ethics and fair reporting. Remember that we as a journalists have a strong influence in the formation of the public opinion and the responsibility to help our Roma citizens to improve their lives and be more equal.
Well, we just got from Asim, lines to follow, and I want to thank first Orhan for a lovely introduction and opening remarks, to Asim for giving us the right, path to go. And to introduce myself for those who have not met me, most of my journalist colleagues have met me somewhere. So my name is Milica Pešić. I'm Executive Director of Media Diversity Institute, which is London-based organization, a British organization, which has been operating in this field of diversity and the media for almost 25 years. One of the programs right now we are riding and running in Western Balkans is called Reporting Diversity Network. And I sincerely hope that, Orhan, this is not the first and last time we are cooperating. I hope we'll find a way to continue cooperating, because MDI has done quite a few programs related to Roma inclusion, Roma integration, particularly related to media. And we are, as much as you are aware how hard is the process, how long way we have to go, but we have fantastic speakers today at this event who will help us come with some potential solutions. Before I introduce my panelists, I'd like to thank my fellow journalists who joined us today. We really thank you for being interested in this topic, and we hope that you will be not only listening to us, but also contributing your thoughts, your experience, your ideas, your suggestions. In aim to do that, just for those who are maybe not technically quite familiar with the Zoom, at the bottom of the screen, you can see there is a Q&A little icon. So you can post your questions and comments there. There is also chat icon. You can also post put your questions there. But there is this raise hand little yellow icon. If you raise that little hand, then you can speak, and there is interpretation. So you'll speak in your native language, and professionals will translate. So we sincerely hope that you will be part of this discussion, not just passive audience, and knowing journalists are seldom just passive. So I hope you'll contribute to this discussion. Now I'll start with the introducing my panelists. And you will see I have three very distinguished gentlemen waiting there and smiling to share their experience and knowledge and ideas with us. First is Stefan Mueller. Stefan, I've learned how to pronounce your name. Stefan Mueller, a political scientist who has been working in this field of Roma-related issues in a variety of settings and in several countries for more than 20 years. And he has been showing a special interest in the Western Balkan and Southeast Europe, topics such as anti-Gypsyism, minorities, refugees, returnees. So a true expert on the issues. Currently, Stefan has been working as an external advisor to the Central Council of the German, Sinti and Roma. Welcome, Stefan. My next speaker panelist is my dear colleague and friend from Britain, Jake Bowers, Mr. Jake Bowers. One of very few Romani journalists, producers in Britain, who has done fantastic work in the field of teaching journalism, filmmaking for more than 20 years. He's been trained by BBC in, how to do production, but he set up his own organization called the Gypsy Media Company in more than, almost 15 years ago. And through that company, he's been working with different clients from, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Swedish Radio, Department of Education, British Department of Education, Virgin Records, Sony Music, just name it. and he's worked for Council of Europe and Organization for Security and Cooperation and European Rights Center. So a very experienced journalist with great contacts in Europe. He's just finished a study on how European media report on Roma, and I hope we'll hear about it. And the last but not the least, as they usually say, is Mr. Bernard Babai, young European ambassador from Albania, who has been directly involved in an organization known as the Roma Gate for Integration. And this organization helps Roma children who live in the streets and who have dropped out of school. So here are the three gentlemen. And here I am, your moderator. So I'll start by actually asking Stefan to maybe tell us a bit more about the very term of anti-Gypsyism and this new framework Orhan mentioned, so that we can then, based on that, continue discussing which way we can go. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I tried to use, I prepared a PowerPoint presentation for you, and I hope you can see it now.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah. So first, I managed the technical problems. This is already the first challenge of today I finally succeeded in. So now to my presentation. What I thought about to do is really give at the beginning an introduction. What does anti-Gypsyism really means? What is the term about? What is the concept of anti-Gypsyism? And then in a second step, what are expressions, manifestations of anti-Gypsyism today? And at the end, I hope we will find also the time that then we can also talk about what could be done to combat or to fight against anti-Gypsyism. The term anti-Gypsyism is at the moment the most commonly used term when it comes to describe or to define racism towards Roma. There are some people which do not like this term so much. There are reasons for that, because the term gypsy is in it and is considered some people as further transporting racism or a racist attitude, which, but in general, the term anti-Gypsyism has been now accepted in the English language by the vast majority of Romani organizations, Romani individuals, but also by the European Union, Council of Europe, etc. When it comes to other languages, one really has to be careful. It doesn't make sense to just try to translate it into other languages. Let's say when we talk about Western Balkans, if it's serving Montenegrin, Bosnian, Croatian, Macedonian, anti-Tsiganism might sound not very well. In Albanian, if we would even say anti-Machupism, this might not be the appropriate terms. Yeah, so it is not up to me to decide which term should be used in which language. This is really then up to the Romani communities in the respective countries, and also for sure of the authorities to say, okay, we are going to opt for this term. Other terms, I know in Serbia, there are now strong groups who are advocating in Serbian anti-Romism. There's also people who use the anti-Roma racism, translate, etc. So this is really an open issue. What is important, however, is the concept which is behind. And this concept really gained ground in the last months and years, sorry, years, not months. There are a couple of definitions. What is anti-Gypsyism? I would like to present you one of these definitions, not to make it too theoretical. And I use the definition of the Alliance Against Anti-Gypsyism. This is an alliance of several Roma and pro-Roma organizations across Europe. And they define anti-Gypsyism. Anti-Gypsyism is a historically constructed, persistent complex of customary racism against social groups identified under the stigma gypsy or other related terms. What does this mean? Oh, sorry, I went too fast. What does this mean also when we think about so anti-Gypsyism is really based on an approach which is homogenizing, which is essentializing the perception description of these groups. And we attribute specific characteristics to this group or to the members of this group, which also means at the end, we see all of them as being the same, or we focus only on some selected features of probably some individuals, and we put this on the whole group. So what we do also with this process then is that we degrade them, we ostracize them. So we put them down, we put them outside of our society, outside of our belonging. So what we produce with this also is a kind of a vicious circle we create. On the one hand, we think they're different, they're not like us. That means they're not as good as we are. They're different from us. Then if they're not as good, they're different. And this has a reinforcing effect, which really produce the situation we have now, that still today Roma are in most of the countries not being considered as a part of the, as a constituent part of the society, and being considered as not as good as the others. So when it comes about the concept of anti-Gypsyism, what if we want to understand and also understand how we can address anti-Gypsyism? First, anti-Gypsyism, it is not a minority issue. The phenomenon and the problem is a phenomenon within and a problem of the majority society. So when we think about how to prevent or how to combat anti-Gypsyism, we have to think about the majority population, and we have to work with the majority population. This doesn't mean that we are neglecting the Roma themselves. Anti-Gypsyism, we have to understand as the root cause and not the result of the social inclusion, of the poor living conditions. And only when we would address only the effects of anti-Gypsyism, this means the poverty, poor quality housing, substandard education, we do not eradicate the root causes. It would help, but in addition, we always have to address the root causes. This is the racism towards Roma, this is the anti-Gypsyism. This means also when we think about what should be done in future or what should be done is, it is also not enough only to fight the racism. Always in parallel, we have to do social inclusion measures, because also this reinforces each other. And what we also have is that anti-Gypsyism, it is a racism which is accepted in large parts of the society. And this doesn't matter if you talk about the Western Balkans, if you talk about the member states of the European Union, this is the racism where people still feel free to express. In Germany, you can be racist towards Roma in a way, or you can give racist statements you can't give about other ethnic or social groups. Further to the concept of anti-Gypsyism, what is really an added value of this concept of anti-Gypsyism is that it switches the focus. It changes the focus from the Roma community's obligation to integrate to the state's institutions' responsibility to effectively deliver equality, non-discrimination, and fundamental rights to Roma individuals. So what we always have to keep in mind, when Roma request the protection and realization of their rights, this is what they do when they request to fight against anti-Gypsyism, because it is nothing else than request the protection and realization of the fundamental rights what they have. And this concept of anti-Gypsyism with this kind of crucial added value is very similar to what the United Nations call the rights-based approach, which clearly defines their responsibilities, the duties of the state institutions, and the rights of the right holders of communities like the Roma. So what does it mean when we talk about policy making? Yet this change of the focus we didn't achieve. So, but we need a change at political level. However, this requires first a change of the mindset, a change of the thinking of politicians, of the majority society, and also among the Roma. So we have really to work on changing the policies and working with the society, and that the media plays an extremely crucial role. We have to work and to change the mindset of the people. Before I talk a bit about this need for a policy change, I would like to take you a little bit back in the past, and in two different ways. Why, on the one hand, in a very distant past, on the other hand, on a more recent past. And all of both going back into the past really refers to the needed change of the mindset. to the more distant past. So what we should never forget, how much life the experiences of our ancestors determine our life. I always try to explain it with my personal situation. I am still the countryside boy as my ancestors. I'm a first generation with university diploma. I still have this way of thinking, attitudes, even kind of values in me, which comes from my ancestors, which includes also stereotypes or prejudice about our groups like Roma or about other groups. But you can work on that, but this is also there. So when we think about the Roma, what kind of past have the Roma? The Roma in Europe, they went through Holocaust. More than 500,000 people have been killed. And this Holocaust, this genocide against Roma, it hasn't been recognized fully. And if then it has been recognized very late. So the survivors in the first 30, 40 years after the Second World War, they hardly saw any recognition of what they went through. They were still treated as second-class citizens. And this is still in the people. This we do not forget. And this, when we look to other places in Europe, when we look, for example, to Romania, in Romania till the mid of the 19th century, Roma were slaves. The abolishment of slavery in Romania happened later than in the United States. This determines the people. This determines the attitude of people. This determines the relationship to the majority, the trust into the majority. But this also determines us, the majority, how we think about these people. So we still have all of this in us. And this is one part what I mean with mindset. We have to get rid of this prejudice, of this form perceptions coming out of the past. When we talk about Western Balkan, I will only briefly touch upon this. But what is very important in the Western Balkans is what happened with Roma during the wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo, or in the conflict also in Macedonia. It is the majority each. In Kosovo, it's the Kosovo Albanians who determine what happened. It is not based on the experience the Roma made. In Bosnia, where are the Roma recognized as victims of the war in Bosnia? How many Roma have been expelled and killed during the war in Bosnia? There's hardly any talking about it. Kosovo, 100,000 Roma have been expelled from Kosovo after the war, 2/3 of the population. This is not an issue. And this is still valid for the people. They still realize it today, 20 years after the war. We can hardly even say what happened to us. So how can then these people feel themselves really as a part of the society? What are we doing as a majority society with them, seeing them as a part? So this only very briefly, I could talk about these topics for a long time, only to really try to make you aware how much the past is still influencing us, our perception of the Roma, and how this influences the attitude of the Roma, or the openness also of the Roma, and our openness towards them. So, next point, when we think about the need of a policy change, this is one thing what I talk with the mindset. Another issue is when we look in the past again, we need a new policy. We have in the Western Balkans and in Turkey, we had strategies, action plans, millions of euros have been invested. We have projects, we have trainings, but the situation of the Roma hardly improved. I myself, I was involved in developing 2 strategies, one in Serbia and one in Kosovo, surprisingly. 18 years ago and 15 years ago, or 14 years ago. What was the impact of this paper? Hardly any, because the governments never tried to really implement this. We can even go back a bit further. We had the decade of Roma Inclusion from 2005 to 2015. Did it have a real impact on the situation of the Roma? No, because what was being proposed, what had been said should be done, was hardly implemented. And in addition, we totally forgot to implement measures fighting against the racism. For me, all over, why did all these policies, why have these policies not been implemented? Why did they fail? For me, a very crucial part is the neglect in these policies to fight the racism, the anti-Gypsyism, and the non-action itself, not implementing these policies on behalf of the governments, but also, let's say, not paying enough attention on behalf of the European Union and Western European, or member states of the European Union. These are also expressions of anti-Gypsyism. Sorry, I'm still have to get used to the technique. Another issue which I really would like to briefly to touch upon when we think about which made it so visible that we have a need for a change with Roma inclusion policies, was the situation during the COVID-19 pandemic. It, like in a magnifying glass, COVID demonstrated the consequences of anti-Gypsyism. When we think about housing, who are the communities who are living in the most dangerous housing situation from a perspective of fighting the pandemic? These are the Roma communities, who are to a large extent exposed to poverty also because of COVID, because the majority of the Roma, they were working in precarious self-employment settings, which they all had to stop during the pandemic. They had no income. So how should they survive if this continues on the long term? When we think about education, many children suffered during COVID that they couldn't participate in education. But the vulnerable, the poor families, the children from poor families even suffered more. And there again, we have the very, very large majority of the Roma belonging to this group. So this kind of anti-Gypsyism, what we have, like in the education system, in the employment, in the housing situation, this came all out again. Wait a second.
Stefan.
Yes, I'm running.
No, it's just that there are already questions for you from the audience, and we haven't yet heard Jake and Bernard, and yet we want to focus more on what can be done in the second part of this discussion, if that's okay with you. Mm-hmm. Can we ask Jake, Jake to take the floor? And I really appreciate that you talked about how we personally also think in stereotypes and MDI events. With the MDI events, I always start by saying everyone has prejudice. I have prejudice, you have prejudice, you have prejudice. We might have different kind of prejudice, but we think in prejudice terms, and it's very difficult to get rid of prejudice, but once we become aware of them, it's already a step forward. So for all of us from the Balkans to feel a bit better, I'd like to ask Jake to tell us, how media in Britain report on Roma. Do you see any difference between what you've heard, what you know about Western Balkans and what you see and experience in Britain? And you did the recent study of Europe. Where is the British media stand?
Sure.
Thanks, Jake.
It'll be a pleasure to. Stefan, I think you need to stop sharing your presentation so that I can share mine, which
I did.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Yes, no, it's So, I suppose to answer your question, Milica, and thank you everybody for welcoming me and bringing me here. It's fascinating for me. I think Stefan's got it spot on, which is that anti-Gypsyism is the root cause of a lot of this stuff, and I think combating it is good work, noble work, and it's one that I've kind of dedicated the vast majority of my adult life to. And so I'm gonna share something with you now, which kind of hopefully everybody can see that. A page which has it should say responsible reporting on Roma inclusion. Can people see that? Is that coming through? Okay, good stuff. Yeah. So yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit about my experience because it's quite ironic. I live in a country that has left the European Union, much to a lot of people's consternation and unhappiness. But there is a universality about the concepts that we're talking about here. They are they're almost the same whether you are in the Balkans or whether you are in Britain. And that is that a lot of the way that we are spoken about as a commuter, and I say we in that I am an English Romany man, mesim Rom kata Anglia, I'm a Roma man from England. We suffer from anti-Gypsyism in all forms of media. And the best way to combat it, which I'm hopefully going to focus on, is you've got to be in it to win it. I think Romany people over the last 20 years or so are increasingly well educated, increasingly articulate, and are increasingly becoming journalists. So this is a kind of a celebration of that. But just a bit about me. So I'm one of Britain's very few Romany journalists and filmmakers. I started about 20 years ago because I was leading a very kind of excluded kind of life, and I thought, a lot of this is driven, the hatred that I see on a daily basis is driven by the media, and I wanted to do something about it. So I retrained as a journalist. I started working for newspapers like The Guardian and The Big Issue, which is a homeless newspaper. Eventually, I ended up working for BBC Radio and Television. And since then, I've kind of not really looked back. I have worked largely for the mainstream media, largely in broadcasting, but also in all kinds of other areas which are part of the mainstream media. I've done a lot of work in advertising. I've done music videos. I've used every platform I could try to access to tell the true story about the Romany community and other communities as well. It's not the only community that I look at, but it's one that's close to my heart. And you know, if you want to see some of what I've done over the last 20 years, I've included that web link there because I don't want to talk about them that much at the moment. But one of the things that I'm most proud of is the fact that I've been a big part of the BBC for years. This image that you see up in the top right-hand corner is me contributing to BBC World News. But I've also been involved in community media for the Romany community. The image you see in the bottom right-hand is the bottom right-hand corner is a community media that we have called Travelers Times, which is by and for the community. For those of you who aren't necessarily that familiar with the British situation, there is a catch-all phrase in British English called traveller, which is a kind of a reference to our nomadic past. It's a problematic term in lots of ways, and we could get into that in a bit, but that's the phrase that a lot of people use. And what we see in Britain is the way that we are regarded, the way that we're spoken about mirrors the way that a lot of media coverage is the same across Europe. There is a maxim in the British media, which is that if it bleeds, it leads. And that means essentially that if there's conflict and it's visual, it will be on the front page of newspapers or at the top of news bulletins. Now, this is one example on the left here. Meet Your Neighbours. The Sun, by the way, is the biggest selling newspaper in Britain. It's read by about 5 million people every day. And it says, the Sun war on gypsy free-for-all, meet your neighbours. Drawing upon, as much newspaper coverage does, a set of kind of myths that perpetuate racist stereotypes. And you see that they're pretty much the same all the way across Europe. They're different. There are nuances from country to country, but they draw upon kind of a folk fear and hatred of our community that goes very, very deep. So let's just go through some of them. One of the biggest ones is that Roma communities are foreign. We do have a history, of course, and a language that comes all the way from India. But when you're talking about our communities, we're talking about communities that have been as part of European society ever, for at least 500 or 600 years. So we might have a foreign ancestry, but we are very much part of the countries that we live in. Another one is that we're all criminals. Another one is that we're lazy, that we don't work. One of my kind of favorite ones, which makes me laugh, is the idea that we have a wanderlust, that we're kind of, when the spring comes, as it will do soon, hopefully, and the leaves come out in the trees and the flowers start blooming, that we just need to travel. Another very popular one, which was very popular in the European media a few years ago, is that we steal children, that we're dirty, that we're inherently nomadic, that we're psychic, that we can see the future. Although if we had seen the future, actually had that as an innate ability, there are lots of things that you would have thought that we would have avoided. That we always take and never give, and that we're stupid. You see that in the British encyclopedias up until about the 1960s, saying that the average Romany average Romany adult has the mental age of a 10-year-old. So our coverage that there is about us is led by conflict. It's often very sensational. It's often very negative, and it has a massive impact on people's lives. This is just a selection of the kind of newspaper coverage that you get about the Romany community in Britain. It's usually around conflict. In Britain, as opposed, and this probably is a bit of a difference with the Balkans, much of the conflict surrounds where Romany people who are still traveling in caravans are able to stop. So the references that you see here to gypsy camp scraps or War of the Roses is about the very real conflict about those people who are still nomadic, who is very much a minority of our community, where they are able to stay. But there are still lots of newspaper coverage as well about Roma migrant communities coming from Eastern Europe, and the one that you see in the kind of the middle here, you pay for Roma gypsy palaces, is a connection with that. So even when people come in from other European countries and come in, the newspaper coverage is largely hostile. And what I always ask people to do when they are journalists is to do this litmus test. And this is 1 week's local newspaper headlines in the British media. It's pretty standard stuff. A lot of it is kind of militaristic language. Gypsies leave devastation, winning the war against travelers. Gypsies leave even more mess. And if you simply exchange the word gypsy or Roma or traveler for another minority group, it becomes very, very clear that what we're talking about here is a form of prejudice which is built and perpetuated by the mainstream media, that it would no longer be tolerated by any other ethnic group. It's brilliant that in the time that I've been alive, the cause of equality has brought lots of people in from the cold. The way the LGBT community, for example, is now regarded in the British media is completely different from the way that it was when I was a child. So it goes to show that change is possible, but it also shows when you swap between this and this, that it's a change that as a community that we're still waiting for. But having said that, with all those threats, and I'm speaking to you as a journalist, speaking to other journalists, I believe there are enormous opportunities also for us as journalists in our communities. And there are mainstream media producers that are really beginning to see this, use it, sometimes with a very bad effect, sometimes maybe with good effects. I don't know how many of you have watched the series Peaky Blinders, which is a big part of British television that has been exported all over the world. I'm not sure what Slavic language this is here, but that's where it is on Netflix, presumably in Poland or somewhere like that. Even across into America, you have the Big Fat Gypsy Weddings franchise that's been sold all over the world with different spin-offs. So there is an ongoing fascination with our communities. There is, however, very few examples of people actually getting it right. I actually think Peaky Blinders is quite an interesting exception to that, in that whilst it does look at a family which is criminal, it has also been an opportunity to teach Britain and the world about parts of Romany history. For example, Charlie Chaplin was from a British Romany family, and that's mentioned in this series. So whilst there is some bad in there, it isn't all bad, which is a bit different from the Big Fat Gypsy Weddings franchise, which essentially was a form of anti-Gypsyism propaganda, which invited the world to laugh at Romany people. So my point really is this, is that I have managed to make a living for the last 20 years by telling the other side of the story, but it's still a drop in the ocean. There are lots and lots of opportunities for mainstream journalists, Romany journalists, to actually be telling the other side of the story about the Romany community. And by other side of the story, I don't mean kind of pro-Roma propaganda, because journalists don't produce propaganda. They deal in conflict and social situations and exploring the truth. That is the ultimate touchstone of journalism. And here are some truths which I think we all need to start recognizing and start exploring, if only because it provides us with content to put in our newspapers, on our radio stations, and on our television channels. And this is the first one. The Roma are Europe's largest and fastest growing ethnic minority. In some parts of Europe, just the very fact of the biology of the situation, which is that a lot of Romany families are still very big and have lots of children, within 20 or 30 years in some parts of some countries in Eastern Europe in particular, the Roma community will be not just a minority, but a majority, pretty much like the Latino population in North America. Another fact which helps and can help journalists access these communities is that Roma people are increasingly well educated, integrated, and articulate. That is a route in for any journalist that wants to see beyond the stereotypes into a community that's there. Another important one, and this is part of the business case for doing the right thing by Romany communities, is that they are already part of your audience as journalists. They may be a part which is not well represented, or it might be, but it is a part of the audience that is there. They want content. They want to kind of consume content. They're also consumers, you know, and any media organization that ignores a substantial part of their audience is missing a trick. I suppose another truth as well is that there is an increasing amount of Roma journalists in all European countries. And for those mainstream journalists who would like to do something different, who would like to see into these communities, but maybe don't know the best way in, Romany journalists are often the best way in, because they come from those communities. Just like any community, they have those contacts and a way in. Another fact which a lot of people never see is that we have a fascinating internal diversity. I speak to you as a relatively pale Romany man from Western Europe, and my cousins in Eastern Europe look very different to me. We have different elements of language that we've kept. There's incredible diversity just within my community in Britain. When you get to some countries where lots of different names apply with lots of different practices and lots of different cultural aspects, there's a fascinating internal diversity there, which is also makes for interesting journalistic copy. Another really interesting fact, I think, is that despite the fact that there is this kind of stereotype about Romany people having a wanderlust or being nomadic, when you go to lots of cities in Eastern Europe which have Romany mahalas that have been there for maybe 400, 500 or 600 years, there's very definite proof that Roma are part of these communities and these countries, and they're not going anywhere. You know, I've been to the mahala in Prizren in Kosovo, and there are houses there that have been occupied in the same place for the last 400 or 500 years. That's a fascinating thing for anybody. And I wonder how many of the mainstream audiences within these countries actually know that. And as Stefan kind of spoke about very eloquently just a moment ago, the Roma community was subjected to the Nazi final solution alongside the European Jewish population. We were the only ethnic group that were part of that final solution, and undeniably more Jewish people died in the Holocaust than we did. But the percentage in terms of its impact on the communities was about the same. A lot of the time, we don't know exactly what the final figure was. Some people say 500,000, some people say 1.5 million people. So as we come up, and I've just noticed a typo in my thing to January the 27th, which is the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz, I would encourage all journalists that are here today watching to kind of note these dates down and hopefully do something about them. On January the 27th, it will be the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. It's Holocaust Memorial Day across the world. And that represents a news hook, an opportunity to tell the story, to fill those gaps that Stefan talked about a moment ago. April the 8th, also coming up soon, was the time when the International Romany Rights Movement was born in London in 1971. It will be its 50th anniversary this year. And you can see a big difference between now and then in terms of the amount of Romany people who are politically engaged. It is a time in every country in Europe where Romany communities come together to celebrate their culture and their history, but it also provides an opportunity for journalists. And probably finally, August the 2nd is the anniversary of the liquidation of what they called the Zigeunerlager. Hopefully I pronounced that right in German, which was the Romany camp in Auschwitz, a time where Romany people fought with knives and spoons and bits of wood not to be sent to the crematorium, whose people played the violins where people were marched past in order to go to the crematorium of Auschwitz. These are all opportunities. There is an opportunity every day for bringing in Romany stories into mainstream media content. But these are three that I thought I would just highlight and pick out for those people who might be looking for a way in and a way of doing something. Just finally, because I'm sure my time is very rapidly running out before Milica jumps in. I don't just try and preach this stuff, I also do it as well. I don't sit back as an academic and tell journalists what they should do. I am a working journalist. I'm working on a series at the moment for Channel 4, which is one of Britain's biggest commercial broadcasters, trying to make them do the right thing. They were the people who invented Big Fat Gypsy Weddings, so they have a lot to answer for in terms of the way that we are portrayed. But at the moment in production, there was a 3-part series, which is the first series in British history which has a Romany producer. That is me, working on it as the main producer. And it's made by Fremantle, one of the world's largest commercial media companies. They produce things like The Apprentice and America's Got Talent. In some ways, they are arguably responsible for maybe inflicting Donald Trump on the world, but he's gone and we can forgive them for that, hopefully, at some point. So I'm not going to say much more. I have other things to tell you about in terms of a media monitoring exercise that we just did about the coverage of Romani communities throughout the pandemic. But I will wait for Milica to guide me back to that when the time is right. So thank you.
Wow, thanks a lot, Jake. A lot of inspirational thoughts and facts shared with us. Just before I kindly ask Bernard to take the floor, just to let everyone know, we have almost 50 participants, and they have already posted questions for all panelists or just for some of you. So as soon as Bernard gives his presentation, I'll start actually with the questions for the panelists. Bernard, the floor is yours, and I'm really pleased that you are sharing your personal experience with us as much as Jake has shared his experience, and then we'll proceed with the questions. Bernard.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be part of this webinar. Maybe we are 3 gentlemen, we don't have any woman in the panel about reporting, responsible of reporting including Roma, but we have pleasure to lead by a woman like such as Milica. Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome friends, media representatives, and others interested in human rights. Welcome Western Balkans youth. I am Bernard Babai. I am a young European ambassador from Albania, and today I will talk about the hate speech. In fact, I want to relate this issue with my personal experience. The first moment when I got engaged with the civil society, I was only 16 years old when I heard in the school corridors that some volunteers were needed to help Roma children to do their homeworks, and what's more important, to encourage those who have abandoned school to return to class. I was so curious as I wanted to know better the Roma community. I have heard before that they have been bullied, that people don't want to be near Roma. I have heard that they were physically attacked. What I knew for sure is that many people have produced towards Roma. I had seen that many Roma in miserable conditions, especially newborn babies lying on the ground next to their desperate matters being for money, and the others barefoot, begging on the street, and what's worse, digging in the trash, trying to find food. I have seen people mistreat them for no any particular reason. I decided that I want to help them and started volunteering. I found out that the reality was more painful, to the point where I even wondered what is more important for them, to survive or to go to the school. When I started working with Roma kids, I realized they are not rude. They want to learn. They are smart. They have everything like other children, like my little cousins, my nieces, except they didn't have the same starting point as them. This encouraged me to go every day and do whatever I can to improve their lives. Uh, I reflected every single night, trying to find a way how to help Roma and how to reduce this gap and misunderstanding between general population and Roma. I decided that it was going to be my war. We've raised our voice instead on including Roma children in different activities according to their skills and preferences, and helped many young Roma to return to the school. and I am very much proud of that. I am happy that I see young people from high school having positive attitudes towards their Roma colleagues. Many raise their voices against hate speech and violence. In reality, hate speech is everywhere. Before, you could hear it on the streets and even in some media. Now, in the time when internet has occupied everyone and everything, hate speech spreads in the speed of light. Once you add the fact that people can easily leave anonymous comments on the internet or social media, and that there is no or a little fear in getting caught, it seems like we will never be able to stop the hate speech. We all see it every day. We all witness the rise of ideology, and not only in developing country, but also in the whole the world. It's a global phenomenon. Haters are loud. This means we need to be louder than them. We can fight it together and in creative ways. Speak up. Don't be silent if you see your brother, your mother, relative, friends, co-worker, or someone you don't even know spreads a hate speech. The hate speech is harmful for individuals, families, communities, and the whole the society. We are all responsible for stopping the hate speech. We should all contribute and whatever we can in order to prevent it. We should encourage all who were a subject to hate speech to speak up and report it. It's our responsibility. The future society needs for strong people who cooperate and work hand in hand together in fighting prejudice and hatred. People with vision who will not be silent. Young people who will speak up whenever they see or experience hate speech. I am convinced that human values will win against anti-values, but only if the change starts from within each and every one of us. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much for everything.
Thanks, Bernard, for this really inspiring speech. There are, as I said, already questions, and I'll read some of them. The questions are coming through different channels. For instance, from Leila Nuhanovic, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, who works for Federal News Agency in Bosnia. A question for Stefan Mueller. Here is the question. I was wondering if you, Stefan, knows what are the reasons why Roma population fared worse when it comes to the post-Second World War awareness of human rights. And it seems the case is still in 21st century when as Leila says, when we are really trying to focus on human rights, what is the root cause of the Roma being least included in this human rights story? I'll read, this is a question for Stefan. I'll read the question which came from Gordana Nešović, which is for everyone. When we talk about anti-Gypsyism and the media presentation of Roma, perhaps we should be aware of that journalists have an educational role in addition to information. To reduce ethnic distance and break down prejudices and stereotypes, it is necessary for the majority, state media, public services, to open space for the presentation of Roma, their culture, their histories, everyday life, and problems. How to do it? This is a question for all three panelists. Stefan, can we start with you, please? And then I'll ask the other two panelists to comment on, to respond to Gordana's question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leila, for the question. One very brief answer would be that the racism is the reason why the genocide against Roma has not been recognized. But I would like to go a little bit more deeper. So when I mean the racism, it's the racism they experienced directly after the Second World War again. But it's again also the history, the legacy which they are carrying with them, and how the history which we as the majority were carrying with us, and the way we behaved against them. I can give you as an example, very briefly, Germany. Germany was the main perpetrator. They were the executors and the planners of the genocide. So what happened in Germany? Still in the 60s, you had court decisions in Germany referring to the Nazi decisions and using this as a justification not to recognize the Holocaust of the Roma and the Sinti in Germany, not to give them compensation. And what we also had, that the survivors of the concentration camps, they experienced the exclusion more or less directly again after the war. When you talk with survivors, when they left the camps and they were trying to build up a new life in Germany, they hardly received any support. The best way for them to survive was to hide, not to make their ethnicity public. I talked to one survivor who was always wearing long sleeve shirts that nobody can see his number, and ask him, why do you have the number? It was then in Germany really only with the 70s when a young civil rights movement started among young Sinti and Roma, and Sinti in particular in Germany, who really had the courage and take it up and started to fight for the recognition of the Holocaust against them. And it took also for them a long time. They made us sit in, they went to the concentration camp in Dachau, made us sit in there and sleep in there, to occupy, to make the public aware, with these action aware. We are also here, we were also victims. Nobody talks about us. And it was really then only from the 80s and the German government realized, yes, and the German society is still in the process of realizing it. I think what I try to explain with the example of Germany is the same all over Europe. It's in every single country. The destiny of what happened with Roma and Sinti and related groups during the Nazi time, it differs. It's not always exactly the same. Yeah? But as a rule, it was a nightmare for them, a nightmare which has hardly been recognized. And the reason for that is really, it's the racism. Again, we didn't take them as serious, as equal as other people. If I might say it now really in bad, they were only gypsies. And this is how not only the politics, the whole society treated them. And again, I think what we have on the political level in the meantime, through the work of the civil rights movement of the Sinti and Roma in Europe, we have a different situation. Governments have to be cautious. They pay attention. They participate in all these events what Jake mentioned. Yeah, when you go on the 2nd of August to Auschwitz, there's always a high-level participation of the German government there. It's always there. Now on the 27th of January, there will be also high-level participation. This was not like this 20 years ago. But where we still really have to work on is the society. Among the society, the understanding what really happened with Sinti and Roma during the Nazi time is so limited. And the younger the people are, the more limited it is. I'm 60, somebody who was 20 has a different connection to this period. Yeah, that's somehow also normal, but we have to keep it up. And that's a very, very important thing what we have to do. And again, media would play a crucial role.
Thanks, Stefan. Can you and Jake respond to Gordana Nešović's question related to prejudice and stereotypes, but primarily educational role of the media? Jake, you has experience with British media in this respect. Maybe you are the right address for this question.
Okay, well, I'll try. I mean, Gordana, I think you're right. I think the media does have a responsibility not just to inform, but also to educate, particularly media that has some form of kind of public sector kind of background. Now, I know it's probably very different in a lot of countries, but in Britain, for example, we have the BBC, which is funded through a license fee, which is paid for by everybody that has a television. And as part of their charter, it is the public sector broadcasting is to educate. So, you know, the BBC should be doing far more than it is. Every public sector state broadcaster should be doing far more than it is to kind of promote inclusion, diversity, and equality. But that doesn't also let private providers, commercial providers of news or media off the hook either. And that's why I kind of, in what I said, I tried to represent it as both threats and opportunities. And I think that there is a spectrum of possibilities there to educate people. It is through the very dark, nasty stuff, you know, of the Holocaust that we mentioned, right away through to the kind of the social conflicts which are caused by bad housing, bad education, bad healthcare, right away through to stuff which is probably more positive and maybe even more populist. I mean, one thing that I did, which I didn't really mention in my presentation, is when I was first getting into television broadcasting, a thing called Britain's Got Talent, which has now been expanded all the way across the world, and the X Factor was on television. And I went to a symposium of journalists and I said, sometimes I think the only way that we are ever going to get through in mainstream journalism is if we did our equivalent of the X Factor. If we did, and I use the word because we still use this word gypsy in our country, if we did a gypsy X Factor. Now at that thing, there was somebody from a tabloid newspaper who on the front page of the Star, which is a very popular tabloid in Britain, put Gypsy X Factor on the front page, and how Romany people were going to get together to kind of sing and dance on television. Now I know there will be people amongst you already thinking, well, we can't just represent Romany people because of their musical talents, and of course we can't. But what I did in the process of that is I managed to negotiate an 8-hour series with Sky, which is one of the biggest broadcasters in Europe, to do something with it. Yes, it's hung itself on the hook of a Romany talent show, but actually music was about 10% of it. We used it as a hook. We departed from the Gajo kind of idea, the non-Roma idea of who we are and what we are, to go deeper into the iceberg of the reality of Romany realities. So I think from the very kind of blatantly political, and that raised, but with a, you know, that comes from a human rights agenda, right the way over to the other side of the spectrum, which is blatantly populist, maybe even kind of exploits the stereotypes that are out there. There are many ways to kind of educate people. And we can't divorce ourselves from the nature of the way that television works, for example, which is it is often quite populist, it is often quite trashy, but that doesn't mean that you have to trash people in the process. It's a very, very difficult line to tread sometimes, but I think it is possible. But coming back to where I started with things like the BBC, for example, should be producing a landmark series about Romany history, which goes all the way, that looks all the way at things like slavery in Romania, at the Holocaust, at the enclosure of the British countryside, which threw our ancestors out of the countryside and marginalized them. State broadcasters have the right, you know, have the duty to do something far more serious and far more intelligent. And I think there are thousands of possibilities and opportunities there. What has to come is the will of journalists and producers to actually do it. But you're right; they have the right. They have the mandate to educate as well as just to inform.
Well, thanks, Jake. I think there is a question also coming from the audience, which is in a way related. You mentioned how Roma are increasingly well educated, and the question is that the case of Britain only? Because in Bosnia and Herzegovina, obviously that's where our contributor comes from. The Roma are still discouraged from elementary education. Secondary education is not even mentioned. Sometimes they are even actively discouraged by teachers to continue their education. How can we deal with this issue of education within educational system? And my addition to this question from Bosnia, Jake, can maybe media, like what you just mentioned, what BBC should be doing, history of Roma in Britain, contribute with their material to educating about Roma and educating Roma? And this is a question, Stefan, if you would like to step in, because I know that you also sees where media come when talking about anti-Gypsyism.
Shall I respond first, and then maybe Steph? I think you're absolutely right about education, and I don't for a moment want to downplay the fact that there is a big problem with Roma communities accessing secondary education, let alone kind of higher education in universities. I think the point I was trying to make is I meet people all of the time that have fought against incredible odds to make it through that system, through secondary and university education. They're still very much in the minority, particularly amongst women, but they are getting through despite all those barriers that are put in their place. And so if they are getting through and they are there and are able to kind of articulate in very powerful terms the truths of the communities that they come from, then there is no excuse left not to engage with them and to tell their stories. I know, for example, a Slovak Romany young man who, when he was growing up in Slovakia, he was destined to go to one of the special schools which Romany children still go to, just simply because of their racial identity. Fortunately for him, and this is not necessarily just saying a great thing about Britain, but fortunately for him, his parents went to Britain, where he went for the secondary school education, he went for a university education, and he's now going to study in Harvard. So if people like Andre Ola can make it, then there are other people as well. But that doesn't mean for any moment that there isn't still an enormous amount of work to do to improve the education of Roma people generally across Europe.
Thanks, Jake. Stefan, maybe we can link two things. Yes. The new document, the new strategy, which came recently from the EU, and then the role of media in eradicating, stereotypes, anti-Gypsy, and all this negative, or simply doing their job properly, doing good journalism, which is the best answer to all problems. Stefan.
I know time is running, but let me add a few sentences to education situation. Yeah. So in general, what we have as a rule, also in the Western Balkan countries, the only area where we see a certain progress is really in education. So the number of Romani children who are attending secondary schools and who are finishing secondary schools or even universities are really increasing. But these numbers are still extremely low in comparison to the majority overall to the countries. But there we really see a certain progress. But where does the progress come from? This is to a very, very large extent, and this includes Bosnia too, from support from outside, through scholarships, through programs, and also through the work of civil society organizations. In Bosnia, we have a very special situation because we have, if I remember well now, 13 ministries of education. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to coordinate it, but there is really a certain progress. In this progress is also a big danger. These children who are attending the secondary schools and finishing schools and attending universities, they have to find jobs, which they don't. They might find jobs in the civil society sector, but not in everywhere. And then I make directly the move then also to media. These children, they have a role model function. A role model function not only for their own community, they have a role model function for the majority. When they would work, when they would find a work in all the professions they were studying and learning. And that's the big danger. And if these children or these young people do not succeed, they will become negative role models. You are stupid because you're gypsy, you don't get it. They got negative role models in their communities. Why should I go to school, spend all my time on learning, and then I do not find a job and my life is worse if I just collect scrap metal? So why should I do this? That's for me. We have this positive development, but we do not use this. We do not really use it. And in parallel, we have in the Western Balkans a lack of workforce in many sectors, and we do not use the potential of the Roma there. Making a step then very briefly to media, also coming back to Gordana's question, for example, one thing what media could do, and we have this in a very, very few countries, where are the Roma public in media and not in the minority media? Czech is an excellent example. Yeah, but for example, in Czech Republic, we had a TV presenter of Romani origin, everybody knew about it. And he was not presenting only the Romani program, which was watched by a few Roma. No, he was a part of the channel program. And this is exactly what I mean. We need Roma being public, visible, and being treated as or being seen as an integral part of the society. They have the same chances, the same opportunities, and the same dangers like everybody else. Now, when it comes to media, I think it's really the basic. When you are a journalist, you check your sources not once, you check it 3 times. So when you do something about Roma, talk to the Roma, listen to them. And I'm not a journalist, I write only sometimes, yeah. But I think what we always should, as a journalist, when I write about Roma, a first question I would ask myself, would I write in the same way about my own ethnic group? If I'm a Serb in Serbia, in Bosnia, would I write about Serbs with the same prejudices I probably write about the Roma? Would I do the same when I'm an Albanian in Kosovo, in Northern Macedonia, or in Albania? Would I write the same way about Albanians I write about Roma? The majority would not, because then they would clearly see the prejudices they do, the generalization. But with Roma, they don't. And I think this is really a very, very, very first step. I don't know what, before I was asked now to come also to this new European Union framework for, how is it now called? I really have to get my track back. The European Union Roma Strategic Framework for Equality, Inclusion and Participation. This has been now in October adopted by the Council of the European Union. So this is a new strategy which is valid for all member states of the European Union, but also for the countries in the accession process. It's equally valid. So this new strategic framework applies in the same way to all countries in the Western Balkans, or even in Turkey, which means that these countries now have to reassess or to assess their current strategies and policies and to change this. When it comes to combating anti-Gypsyism, this new strategic framework very much builds upon recognizing and fighting, recognizing the anti-Gypsyism and fighting against it. This should be done as a kind of a standalone component. So it means really directly in different forms. I could talk a little bit about it, but also when we think about education, when we think about employment, when we think about housing, that each time we have to think about how much does anti-Gypsyism affect the situation of the Roma in education or in employment. I give you one example from employment. When we think about employment, we have in many countries active labor market measures trying to include Roma into the labor market. Unfortunately, it's not always on a high quality, in high quality professions or high quality training, but it very often also depends on the educational background of them. But what we also see in parallel is that we have employers who refuse to employ Roma, even if they would get tax incentive, they would get wage subsidies. No, they say we don't want to have Roma working with us. We have colleagues who say, no, I don't work with Roma, so the employer is not going to employ them. So this means when we do something, let's say in employment, we have in parallel always to fight this kind of anti-Gypsyism in it.
Thanks, Stefan. There are more and more questions coming for the panelists, and we have now 50 members of the audience. I'll read a couple of comments / questions. Albana Agoli is talking about how media prefer going after interesting, I would say, sensationalistic stories rather than what is of public interest. So Albana sees that as one problem. The other problem is the difficulty in changing mindsets of the public, which have been built for years. And she wants Jake to respond to this comment or remark by her. Jake, do you want to take over, please?
Sure. Well, I mean, I can see Albana's, unfortunately, there's a tendency the media runs more after interesting news for the public than for the public interest. Yes, I think you're right. And I don't think there's anything necessarily that we can do about that, even if we should. It's, I think, something that's innate to human nature, that we're interested in conflict and we go for it. However, what you see in the reporting of conflicts where there are Roma people involved is all too often that the voice that is represented is that of the non-Roma. So even in situations which are inherently negative, the Roma participants in it still have a right of a reply. They still have the right to be represented and to not be omitted. One of the most insidious forms of journalism I think that there is that these stories are talked about and then the journalists don't have the means or the guts to go and speak to the community itself. And if you look at the situation in Britain, just as an example, there is a big conflict about where Romani people who are still nomadic put their caravans. And so when they are put somewhere, which inevitably upset somebody. These stories become front page news. And very, very rarely do the journalists ever go and speak to the community members themselves to ask why that's happening. If they were to do so, they would find out that there is a national shortage of where people put their caravans, that there is a homelessness crisis that's related to education and health. So even in stories which are driven necessarily by social conflict, there isn't the balancing force of a Romani voice. The racism is one of omission. That we're removed from the situation, or there's a kind of a paternalistic situation where a supposed expert, who is usually not a Romani but usually a well-meaning Gajo from somewhere, will be asked to speak about us. Why? When there are people from the community that can speak far more eloquently about their own situation. So I think we can't necessarily change that about the agenda of the news media, and maybe we shouldn't necessarily. But there are also other stories, you know. There are lots of stories which can also be conflict driven, which can be taken from a different point of view. You know, the kind of, I don't know, there is a scandal, for example, which I'm making a film about at the moment, of Romani children being massively overrepresented in state care. 80% in some European countries of the people in state children's homes, they are Romani children. There are countless stories there of families in a period of conflict trying to get their families back. Conflict cuts both ways, both in terms of the impact on the majority society, but also the impact of racist policies on people from minorities. So you can still use the populist, if it bleeds kind of way into it, to tell Romani stories. But you can't if you don't know the community. And that's why it's essential that mainstream media reporters connect with Roma civil society and Romani journalists. Because also, to come back with to Stefan's point, is that yes, there are people that are making it through education, but talent is nothing without opportunity. If you are not given the opportunity as somebody who is potentially a fantastic reporter or a journalist that comes from a Romani background, yeah, you would have wasted those years on becoming well educated, potentially just to go back to searching for scrap like your family does. So there is a big role, I think, for mainstream media organizations to take inclusion seriously and to think about training, to think about making those links directly with talented people from the community, to bring them into their newsrooms and into their operations, not just as Romani reporters, but as reporters that are from a Romani background. And I know we have a great participant here at the moment, Layla Savage, who's doing some amazing stuff in Canada. She's originally from the Balkans, so I'm hoping that later at some point we'll ask a question and maybe we can bring her to the floor, because she's a really good example of a Romani woman who is reporting on lots of issues, like Indigenous issues in Canada. And there's lots that we can learn from her as well.
Thanks, Jake. Well, it would be great to hear from you, Layla Savage. You can bring some experience from Canada. I still remember when still Czechoslovakia, what was called Czechoslovakia, a place called, there was a little town when even the mayor of the town was encouraging Roma people to move to Canada. From Ostrava to Ottawa was the motto. So what's happening in Canada would be really interesting, Layla, if you want to share with us. Meanwhile, I'd like to read a comment from Andrija Đukanović from Romanet portal in Montenegro. He wrote a comment in his native language, but basically what Andrija is saying, we produce stories about Roma community and successful stories about members of this particular community. Unfortunately, mainstream media very seldom offer anything else but sensation or stories related to crime. Sounds so familiar, you know, Andrija, it's not only Montenegro, unfortunately, but I want just to correct you slightly. You said there are no awards for stories about Roma. Actually, last year, I was a member of the jury, European Union Journalism Award in Montenegro, and we gave an award actually to the radio station from Berane, and it was a story about a Roma girl who was sold, then sent back and things like that. So sometimes we do award this kind of stories, but the question for everyone is, can success stories be appealing to the audience and contribute to change of the perception of Roma among the audience? I know we've all tackled this question already today, but I'm sure there is more to be said. So all three panelists, please come out if you are interested, if you want to contribute to this particular question. Who wants to start? I don't think my panelists are shy.
I'm happy to talk about it, but I feel like I've said enough. So maybe Stefan or Bernard.
I'm the moderator, so I'll say when you've said enough. No, let's start with Jake, and then I'll really appreciate, Stefan, if you contribute.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that we're up against here. For example, there is in Britain a Romany police association. Great story. People, so it completely tackles the idea of Roma being inherently criminal. Very, very difficult to sell to the mainstream media. So why is that? I think it's because the independence of the media is they're very wary of anything that would come across as propaganda. And I think that's why they reject it. It doesn't mean it's not a good story. I just think it means that stuff like positive case studies and role models are difficult to sell unless you do it in the right way. And let me just think, I'm just trying to think of some examples in Britain. We have a community in Britain called the Irish Travellers, that's their name. And some of them have become incredibly famous footballers. And one of the biggest problems there is they no longer say who they are. You have people that come from communities that become role models and they then don't want to talk about it. I think that's also a big problem. It's not one I've necessarily got an answer to, because those role models are out there. I think, though, the mainstream media is nervous about them and rejects them because it smells of propaganda to them. And I don't know how you get past that, other than trying to find a way of kind of weaving it in. But then also, we don't want to produce stuff that is just tokenistic. I mean, we could make stories just about, the first Roma barrister in Britain at the High Court. But then that might just seem tokenistic. I don't know if I have an answer on that, other than I think it's a universal problem of how you get that into the mainstream media.
Definitely. Stefan, do you want, Bernard, do you want to add anything to this question?
A little bit I would like to add. I think I'm more or less on the same line like Jake. A too strong focus on these positive role models or on these positive persons might be counterproductive at the end. It could be, at least. I think what we really have to is a real balanced reporting. So also try to report that it is something normal that Sinti or Roma are successful or are in professions or doing like everybody else. One example which came to my mind is in Germany, there's every year is, how to translate it into English, the queen of the wine queen being elected. Yeah, so from all areas in Germany where they have vineyards and which are famous ports, they have each from this little area, they have their own queen every year, and then the queen of the year is elected. And this is a relatively important position. Yeah, so she's presenting, going around the world. And this year, a Sinti woman, a Sintista, so Romani woman, have been elected. She's studying Japanology and that university. So, and this made the media, but it didn't make the media like a gypsy is the wine queen. No, it was a story about her, and it was mentioned that she is one. And like it has been mentioned that she studies in Japan, or she studied in Japan, it has been mentioned that she has a Sinti background. I think this should be at the end the more appropriate approach for me as a guy who reads the media. I think this might be more interesting. I don't know if we have the time. I saw that Lela Savage wants to say something as might be more important than me about these expressions and manifestations of anti-Gypsyism. I think also for the media that they understand really what is this anti-Gypsyism, how do we recognize this and how do we see this, and then reporting accordingly about it is also a very important thing, that they better understand what is anti-Gypsyism. If you have evictions as an example of Roma, how do we protest? We can say, okay, people didn't pay the rent, they kick them out. That's normal. or I report about it, try to describe how the situation is that they have been evicted. The way they have been evicted, has it been legal? Has it been not legal? Has there been alternative accommodation? What is the right of them? This is also that we understand what are expressions of ownership systems, and then we can probably even better report about it. If possible, I can briefly talk about it, but I would like to give the floor to Leila now.
I am kindly asking Leila to join in, and if that's okay with the organizers, that will be the last question and comments, so we can finish on time as planned. Otherwise, you know, journalists, they will disappear. Leila, the floor is yours. Leila or Lela? Can you hear us, Lela?
She just put a comment saying, "Sure, can you let me in?" I think whoever the moderator is has to.
Yes, the moderator. Yeah, can you please let Lela in?
Lela, please try to unmute yourself.
Hello. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Leila.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, we can go on, Lela.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to add a few points to begin the beginning of the question, which is, can positive role models really change something? And I think that, to Jake's point, yes, we must go beyond tokenization. But I think about, you know, like here in North America, for example, when I watch TV with my daughter and we watch Netflix, there are shows about indigenous, you know, animation. There's shows about, you know, people in Hawaii. There's shows about Asian communities. There's lots of shows that she enjoys watching, which are about Black communities, weirdly. And I guess I like that. I find it's very encouraging. And I have nothing to show her that makes her feel proud to be Roma, right? So I think we need to think about this. Yes, maybe certain journalists have the privilege to, you know about certain positive role models. But when I go back to the community, lots of Romani people do not know that there are Roma people can be journalists, doctors, that we can be nurses, that we can be normal, right? So I think we must think about it in a wider spectrum. And thinking about it, I'm also thinking about who's part of the audience, you know? I feel like very oftentimes Roma are not part of the intended audience in many mainstream media. And that's why, for example, you have a lot of fake news circulating amongst our community. A lot of people in the community are currently dying of COVID-19 because they don't believe in it. And why do they not believe in it? Because mainstream media have not done their work and making that information available to Romani people and making Romani people part of the audiences. So we must go much, deeper into those questions, thinking about how can we make Romani people part of the audiences. Yes, positive role models are extremely important, but I think to many points I've seen, for example, I haven't seen Alina Serban, who's a Romani actress who has won prizes in Cannes and biggest festival, on the cover of a magazine, right? I haven't seen these positive role models on covers of magazines, on covers of mainstream shows. When I open my TV in Canada, I see a Muslim woman who's Black, who wears a hijab, who hosts a national show interviewing people during elections. I myself have covered the elections, and I haven't seen many examples of that. So what I see very oftentimes is, I think to Jake's point, we do have Roma journalists, but Roma journalists often, that's something I'm currently writing about, are often catered to the Roma programs where they will be writing about culture, not necessarily will be shedding light on hate speech, on the concerns, on holding governments accountable to what they're doing towards the Roma. And so I think that we must think about that as well in mainstream media spaces that are opening up to Roma programs. Think about how you're basically upholding white supremacy, or are you reproducing it, right? So those are some of the things that I'd like us to think about. And now in terms of thinking about how we can change this today, definitely, I think we should be thinking about investing in programs for Roma journalists so that Roma journalists are more professional, but also thinking about giving up space as non-Roma journalists, right? A non-Roma journalist doesn't really need, if you really want to change things, you don't have to be an expert in covering Roma issues. If you really want to help, why don't you help a Roma journalist be that expert? What will you do to bring in that space, right? Because very often what I find is that we're reproducing systems of power where Gajo are becoming the experts in covering Roma, and Roma journalist, for example, will be covering the culture, right? Which is not really changing anything. So I think we must go far beyond that and helping Roma better cover fake news, helping Roma better cover hate speech, helping Roma holding governments accountable and creating spaces where the Roma will be winning those prizes. Because very often there are some great reports currently I'm seeing, for example, in Balkan Insight about Roma people, but they're never written about Roma. They're never written by Roma journalists. And I think that's highly problematic. So we must think about how do we decolonize this, right? So that would be some of the things I would add. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like me to say.
Leila or Lela? Are you Leila or Lela?
Lela.
Lela, like my sister. Lela, thanks so much. I think this is the right ending of this discussion, except if our panelists want to add anything, but I'd love women to end this discussion, because there were 3 men talking for more than 1 hour. And if you agree with me, thanks Lela a lot. I'll pass it now to Orhan, but I think Orhan, before you do closing remarks, we are to see a documentary on Roma International Holocaust Day. Am I correct, Orhan?
Exactly. Allow me just to simply thank the panelists for taking their time to join us at this very important event. And most importantly, thank our attendees who came up with these excellent questions and excellent discussion points that will actually further and guide our work in the upcoming period. And allow me also to thank you, especially Milica, for your excellent moderation skills. I think that you very nicely summed up the main points and ideas, and you very well guided this discussion. I think that there is quite a lot of potential here for cooperation between the RCC and the Media Diversity Institute, but also with bilaterally with the journalists who are present today. So I would like to thank you all for your attention, for your participation today. And I would invite the technicians to play our last video, and we will conclude this webinar. Thank you.
Kana vilem kaj čavorra, vono rovenas taj pučenas. Kačeja, deamen mangro, deamen šećeri. Palamande sa zgodova mai pari vrijama savime hačarda ando campo. Na mardape, na pučipe. No godola čavorra. The genocide of the Sinti and Roma was carried out from the same motive of racial mania, with the same premeditation, with the same wish of systematic and total extermination as the genocide of the Jews. We speak of the Holocaust and Roma genocide because we want our societies to stand up to hatred early on. Who forgets the past keeps repeating it.
Wow. Well, we will not forget the past, but we have to turn towards the future as well. Orhan, do you want to say something for the end, though this film has said everything? And MDI is going to mark the International Holocaust Day through our work in London as well, through our regional work through MDI Western Balkans, run by Ivana Jelacha. Thank you, Stefan, Jake, Bernard. Thank you, Orhan, for giving us the opportunity to discuss these important issues. Thank you, Lela, for joining, even though it was not planned. Fantastic contribution. Thank you, fellow journalists, for asking questions and making this discussion livelier and more memorable. Hope to see you all in person. Zoom is Zoom, but human contact is something we are all craving for. So thank you very much, everyone. Orhan, if you want to say something, I am done with my part.
Thank you, Milica, and I want to thank you once again. And yeah, well, hopefully very soon in the near future, we will have a similar event, but live in person, tete-a-tete. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye.